Yeah!
Wow. Who'd you bribe to come, Doug?
Everyone who's here.
Nice.
So welcome to the 3rd annual Mad River Story Slam. And thanks for being part of it, everyone.
Yes.
Nice round of applause for all of you. So this whole idea started, well, let's see if this is the 3rd annual.
You're a math
3 years
teacher,
ago.
Aren't you a math teacher?
I am.
Okay.
It started 3 years ago when, in the midst of COVID, Jessica Tompkins, shout out Jessica.
Hi, Doug.
She's not here. She's in the camera. She's going to watch it later. So she came to me and said, Doug, we should do one of those moth story slam things. And I said, okay. So 3 years ago, we did it on Zoom. And then last year, we did it for the first time live right here. And you are part of continuing on this tradition of story slams in the Mad River Valley. So great. Thanks for coming. This year's theme, we both made sure that we had it in our script to mention the theme because we neglected to do that.
That's right. We love you, Allison, because she reminded us we forgot to tell people the theme last year. Awkward.
So, family dysfunction.
Not
Dysfunction
fun.
with the emphasis.
That sounds like a
on
mushroom. It's fun, not
function. Well, I want to get the CT in there. Anyway, family dysfunction with an emphasis on the fun. And we've got a variety of stories around that theme. It's interesting how you can have a theme and have so many different interpretations of that theme. So that's part of what is really interesting about these evenings. Little bit about how we got to this point, and Susan's going to go into this little more detail, but several months ago, I put out the word and asked for some storytellers, and we got a bunch. And we had 2 workshops, and where we learned about the art of storytelling and how to practice and how to get it ingrained until it becomes, well, it is their story. So, but how it comes out naturally without sounding memorized or, reading. So you're going to see the fruits of their labor. Traditional moth story slams are people just come in from the audience, but here we have curated stories, which means they've been practicing. So we hope you really enjoy their story. And I have some details about the building. You see the 2 red EXIT signs? Those are exits, emergency exits, in case anything should go awry.
What could
possibly go wrong in a building from the 1840s? I don't know. Bathrooms, we are going to have a short intermission, so there's a bathroom right in the lobby, and there are 2 backstage. Should you decide to venture backstage, we can help you out with that. And I am going to leave the rest of the description to Susan.
Okay.
Great.
Thank you, Doug.
You're welcome.
So, as always, we want to thank Sue Schmidt, who, if you're not familiar with her, she is the curator for the Moth Storytelling event up in Burlington. So, we're not worthy. Thank you, Sue, for your support in our workshops, taking the time and really supporting our budding storytellers here in the Mad River Valley. Sue has a real gift to get at the heart of a story and really mine it for humor while finding that elusive nugget of truth that will really resonate with an audience. And she's really been helpful in helping our storytellers get those stories out. So telling stories is really an important part of being human and allows us to create an often intimate connection with others, which is pretty amazing. The process of preparing for this type of event involves coming up with a first-person, true story, right, that broadly fits our theme, as Doug said. Writing it up, reading your story aloud to anyone willing to listen, and then having a willingness, this is the hard part for me, to kill your darlings. You have to be open to criticism and be willing to edit out some of the details that maybe don't support your story or are superfluous or don't really help advance the storyline. And then finally, you have to time yourself to make sure that story fits between 5 and 7 minutes. So some events, we've been kind, Doug, I think, but some events, they kind of get the hook.
They do.
And it's a little harsh.
It's ruthless.
It's a little ruthless.
We are not ruthless
We're
here.
not ruthless. Well, Doug is not ruthless. But all the while that you're working on these stories, you have to honor the arc of a story. Some of you might remember this from English class. There's a setup, so you're giving some details of the characters, what your desire is, what the setback is, a climax, and then a resolution to your story. It's not easy, and sharing stories with people really takes courage. So I want you to all give it up for your brave friends and neighbors who are willing to share a piece of themselves tonight with you through story. So.
I'm going to tuck this away a little bit, if I may. Sorry about that noise, Ruth Ann.
Of course you may.
Yeah.
Our first story is Rafting with Dad by Larry Guild of Warren. When asked the question, who was your favorite relative as a child? Larry said, it was my grandfather on my mother's side because he played a big part in my life and was a calm, mature influence in a family that was often filled with chaos. He was the kind of guy that read the instruction manual first. Please welcome Larry.
And Larry is tall. All right, that looks good.
My father would have really benefited if children came with some sort of instruction manual. Not that he was the kind of guy who would actually have read the instruction manual, but he just didn't seem to get that some activities are appropriate to do with kids and some activities are not. He was a multi-sport star athlete in high school and college, and often parented using sporting analogies. He would say things like, if you dig down deep and you try your hardest, you can come from behind and win the game, or you could just do a little bit better in biology next semester. He was a loving man, and I think that in his heart, he really wanted to be a good dad, but I don't think that he really had a clue what that was. My parents were married young. They had 6 children in 10 years. They got married twice, and they got divorced twice. When the first divorce rolled around, Dad called us all into the living room. I was 9, and he informed us that he was going to be moving out, but that everything was going to be okay because on Saturdays he was going to come pick us all up, and we were going to go have fun family adventures together. My older siblings, who were in the latter parts of high school and going into college, just said, Dad, there's no way we're spending Saturdays with you. But I was 9, and my 2 little sisters and I just didn't really realize that we had a choice. So, true to form, he came and picked us up on many a Saturday and took us on many inappropriate adventures. This story is about one of those Saturdays. Dad had an interesting interpretation of what a appropriate family activity was. He called it scrounging around, and he would take us to an old abandoned building in Springfield, Massachusetts, or the Longmeadow Town Dump, or a train yard, and we would just sort of scrounge around looking for cool stuff. And then based on what we found, he would come up with some sort of an activity. On this particular Saturday, it was about this time of year, actually. He had us there's a big train yard just south of Springfield, Massachusetts, by the South End Bridge there. And we were wandering around, scrounging around, and came across this, like a boat ramp that went down into the river, and there was a large pile of construction debris, just all kinds of crap, basically. Dad took one look at it, and he just said, oh my God, we are going to build the most awesome raft of all time. And he was good with his hands, and he was a big, burly, strong guy. And over the next few hours, we all worked together, and he took a couple sheets of plywood, lashed 4 55-gallon drums to the bottom of them. He constructed a roof of a sheet of plywood over the top. We found some chairs and put those on the deck, some cushions. My sisters and I fashioned paddles out of boards, and Dad made himself a big oar that he could use off the back of the raft. And we pushed the raft down into the river. It floated high and dry, and we thought, wow, that is a pretty good-looking raft. Now, I think it's important to note here that my father had absolutely no boating experience whatsoever. I'm pretty sure that he had not been in a canoe up to this point in his life. He had 3 children under the age of 10 with no safety equipment or life preservers of any kind. Like the Connecticut River would be right now, it was at the spring snowmelt runoff, so it was probably 5 to 10 feet above its normal height, and the current was ripping. It's a half-mile wide there, right just below the South End Bridge. And, you know, this is where the risk assessment thing would have come in handy for my dad. Because, you know, his next decision, obviously, you know, was incorrect. We all climbed onto the raft, and, you know, close to the shore, there wasn't any current. And, you know, little kids hanging off the side of a piece of plywood, sitting on a 55-gallon drum, practicing paddling. You know, Dad on the back with a big oar. And Dad felt pretty good. We all felt pretty good about it. And Dad eased the raft out into the current of the Connecticut and immediately lost control of the raft. It was spinning in circles because it didn't have a bow. It didn't know which way to go because it was just a square thing. And so it was spinning, and Dad was a big guy, like over 200 pounds. And so whenever he moved, the raft tipped. And it was really scary. And as soon as we got out into the current, you know, we just started moving downstream really fast, and also directly out across the river, like away from shore. And, you know, back to the no boating experience, you know, Dad just panicked. I mean, I'd never seen him afraid of anything. He was paddling wildly on the back of the boat. He was encouraging us to try and paddle, even though he had no idea what to tell us to do. And we were pretty far out in the river at this point. And I forgot to mention that we had our Irish setter Skippy with us. Not on the boat, but he was on shore and running around and barking and going completely crazy. And as we got further and further out in the river, it just became too much for him. He jumped into the river and started swimming out to us. So at this point, we're more than halfway across the width of the river and, you know, really moving downstream. And Dad is just totally freaking out. And in his warped sense of being the heroic, come from behind to win the game athlete, he decided the most logical thing to do would be to strip down to his boxers, tie one of the ropes around his waist, and dive into the river and swim and tow us back to shore. Before he dove in, he said to my little sisters and me, "Lighten the load, throw everything off the raft." He dove into the river and started swimming frantically. Now, we threw everything off the raft. We threw in the chairs, we threw in the cushions, we ripped off the roof, we threw in our paddles, we threw in Dad's big oar. And we laid down on our bellies and hung our legs into off the back of the raft and tried to kick to help Dad move the raft. And we were still going towards the opposite shore. After a little while, he climbed out, and he was white as a ghost, dripping wet in his, you know, whitey tighties, and said, I just can't do it, it's too cold. Where are the paddles? How could you throw off the paddles? But Dad, you told us to lighten the load. At this point, Skippy got out to the raft and got tangled in the rope that Dad had been using to try and tow the raft, and must have panicked and started swimming back towards shore, and lo and behold, we were going back towards the other shore. We were convinced that Skippy was towing the raft. Of course, we're jumping up and down. Go, Skippy, go, you can do it. Growing up there and driving back and forth across the South End Bridge, and looking down at that section of the river, you know, horrified that I actually had ever had this experience. I realized there's an S turn in the Connecticut River there, you know, so the current goes out across the river and then back to the other side. It goes around the S current. You know, our paddles and Skippy were having no effect on what the raft was doing whatsoever. We were just following the current. But we believed Skippy was saving us. And Skippy continued to swim towards shore, the rope remaining taut. And I don't know how many of you have boating experience, but coming into the shore of a river like that is incredibly dangerous because there's all these tree trunks that are kind of where the trees have fallen down into the river, and the current is just ripping through them. And as if someone was watching us from above, the raft just nuzzled up against one of these big willow trees, and we were able to step off and walk up the tree trunk to the shore. You know, high fives, what a great boating adventure, this has been amazing. And Dad just said, whatever you do, don't tell your mother. I went on to have 2 boys of my own, and I have to admit that I adopted quite a few of my dad's parenting techniques. Definitely not his boating techniques, but his sense of spontaneity and adventure filled many a Saturday for my boys and I with a lot of fun. Thank you very much.
Another one of those, don't try this at home. There, that's more like it. Our next storyteller is someone many of you may know if you're if you have the last name Robinson. Charlotte Robinson, who lives in Warren. Darlin, it's entitled, Darlin, You Don't Even Know I'm Here. When asked the question, who was your favorite relative as a child, Charlotte exclaimed, "It's my favorite Aunt Karen. She lives in Vermont, and she let me come up and visit her each summer and had no rules except to be nice and stay outside." Please welcome Charlotte. We can bring that down a little bit. There we go.
All right. In 1991, my husband, Steve, and I spent 2 weeks in Hawaii, one for our honeymoon week before our wedding week. First stop, Maui. My father lived on Molokai, and he was going to join us, but we were staying in 2 separate hotels. When my father saw our room, which was a suite, he decided that there was plenty of room for all of us, and he canceled his room. When I tried to explain to him that that really wasn't what we had in mind, he cut me off and said, "Darling, you won't even know I'm here." What could go wrong? So, I have to tell you a little bit about my father. He's an only child, and a little like Larry's father, he believes that the rules don't apply to him. He's around 6'3", Ichabod Crane, skinny. He's had a mustache as long as I can remember, probably forever. He's fun, charismatic. He loves to drive fast, listen to loud music. He smoked cigarettes and popped marijuana. And was never really much of a drinker until he met Mother, Marcia, and Debbie. Debbie, his 4th wife. She was a raging alcoholic, and I didn't like her. And Daddy became an alcoholic as well, so we were quite estranged during that period. Because I was a senior in high school, and he would show up at our high school parties. He would show up drunk. He would show up to school events, track meets, whatever, drunk. So I hated it, but all my friends loved it because he was one of the #1 weed sellers in our town. And he always brought party favors. Not for me. So, we we stayed estranged for a while. I went off to college. After freshman year, I moved to Vermont, and I met my husband, Steve. Well, he wasn't my husband yet, but I met Steve. And after only 3 months of dating, I decided it was time to take Steve home to meet the family and my friends. All of my family and friends knew if I was bringing him home after 3 months, this was a real deal. So my grandmother was very concerned, and she really, really wanted me to introduce Steve to my father. I didn't want to do that because I knew he'd embarrass me, he'd be drunk. But I love my grandmother, and I'll do anything for her, so I agreed. But I had to have a chat with Daddy, and he promised he would not drink, and he promised he would not bring Debbie. So I reluctantly agreed to meet him at the fish camp near his home. It ain't fancy, but it's tasty. How many of you guys have ever been to a fish camp down south? It's delicious. So Steve and I get there first. We're sitting out on the deck. It was a beautiful night. We're just chatting, and I'm a nervous wreck. And all of a sudden we hear swearing, shrieking. I look over. I see my father coming in his truck part of a semi 18-wheeler, whatever you call it. Just the truck part. And it's bouncing and lurching and jerking, and we hear shrieking and screaming again, and it comes to a sudden abrupt stop because it stalled, and out jumps Debbie. And then around comes my father, and Debbie's swearing and screaming, and he's yelling and cussing. He's wearing blue jean shorts, and I mean short shorts, and cowboy boots. And they're staggering drunk. Now, this is a great story, but if you want to hear the rest of it, you'll have to come to another story slam. Back to Hawaii. Steve and I had the best time in Maui. We ate great food, we hiked, we hung out on beaches, we got back to the hotel, and we were psyched. We walk in, and there's Daddy sitting at his little area with a Crown and Coke. We set the keys down, and we're about to tell him all about our day, and we're all excited. He jumps up, grabs the keys, and starts to walk out the door. I said, whoa, whoa, whoa! Where are you going? Well, I'm taking the car, darling. You're not driving our car. I paid for that on my credit card, and you're not an authorized driver. No way! And you're drunk! He was madder than a wet hen. He was swearing, just stormed off walking. So we held fast. I kept the keys. We went to bed. No sooner than I got to sleep, I hear rustling around, jingling of keys. I jump out of bed. Steve's still sleeping. I jump out of bed. There he is at the door, holding the keys with a drink in his hand, ready to go out gallivanting. I say, Daddy, you're not taking the car. He starts yelling at me. I say, shh, people are sleeping. This gets all mad, goes back. So I wait, and I wait, which seems like an eternity, for him to go back to sleep, because I know he's going to try this again. I'm so mad, I could chew up nails and spit out barbed wire fence, but I wait him out. He falls asleep. I hear him snoring, muttering to himself, all the things you do when you're sleeping. I go into the bathroom. I gather all our things. I wake Steve up. I say, come on, get your bag. We're leaving. Daddy's on his own. Bless his heart. We sneak out that door, run across the hall down to the elevator, press the button, down to the parking garage. My heart's pounding. Get to the parking garage, unlock the car, get in the car. I back out of the spot. Steve hasn't said one word, poor guy. He's just following me. Just as I'm about to put it in drive and go forward, out comes Daddy from the stairwell. And he's in his underwear. What is it? Larry's dad's in his underwear. My dad's in his underwear. He's also in his, not shorts, not boxers, tighty-whities. But his are red. He throws himself on top of the car, like this, on the hood, and starts screaming, you're not leaving, da-da-da, I'll spare you all the words. I roll down the window and I say, "Daddy, get the hell off the car!" Which he doesn't do. So I just sit there. I look at Steve. He hops out, calmly walks over, moves my dad aside, and says, "Drive, I'll catch up with you." Did I mention Steve's a runner? I throw it in drive. I drive down about 2, 4, 6, I don't know, blocks. I pull over, and my heart. I look in the rear view. There's Steve, jogging along behind me like it ain't nothing. Gets in the car. We're on our way to the ferry dock because we're leaving that island. We're going back to Molokai. We drive in complete silence for what seems to be an eternity. And then Steve turns around and looks at me and goes, "Darling, you won't even know I'm here." Thank you.
All right. Next up, we have Barb Garvin of Waitsfield. Family is where you find it. When asked the question, who was your favorite relative as a child, Barb claimed it was Aunt Polly, whose warmth, positive outlook, sense of humor, and fun always made visits to her house a holiday. Please welcome Barb.
In 1980, my husband walks to the Warren store for a cup of coffee and never left, as he likes to tell it. And I find myself married into a family I never expected to have. Now, this was a family that wasn't only the staff that worked there, but the customers as well, many who came every day, like the Breakfast Club. It was a fun place to be. There was the smell of hot coffee and fresh baked goods and a fire in the wood stove. There was always someone to chat with. You felt like you were at home there. People were there to have a good time, and I'm getting scared. Let me take a breath. Okay. We came from a small family. I came from a small family. 2 siblings and, okay. I'm freezing here. Okay. Let's just tell. All right, let's tell the story. Okay. I came from a small family. 2 siblings, handful of aunts and relatives that all lived really close by to each other. So one time when my husband and I decided that we were going to move to Vermont, we quit our jobs. To them, it was like we lived in the tundra. And visits just became one way, with me driving home to see them. It didn't take long. We had only been here in the summers to visit. And by the time December rolled around, I realized that if you were not a fan of coming down the mountain, barreling down the mountain in sub-zero weather, then it really wasn't going to be a good winter for you. And I felt lonely, and I missed my family. So maybe I was vulnerable. I mean, who adopts their husband's workplace as family? But I did, and maybe it was the wonderful parties that the owner of the store threw for the staff. She was an amazing lady, in a Devil Wears Prada kind of way, stylish, and she cooked up these great gourmet meals. They were just wonderful, and she served great wine. And we always ended up with the parties with a call for a human pyramid or a food fight or some kind of ridiculous thing that her young and undeserving staff deserved. But she never seemed to mind, She hosted the Warren 4th of July every year, so she was used to parties, The store was open like 24/7, and it was 7 days a week, and, it was like some Dickens tale. We found ourselves that we weren't going back home for family anymore, and we started having holidays and celebrations at home, which was here. with staff that became like family. It was like this store had become a central part of our lives. It was the first place that we went when our daughter was born on our way home from the hospital. It was really, and then Jack became manager, and it became 24/7. We'd get calls like all the time. The staff would call so often, anytime that he was home, you know, can you bring English muffins, and where's the bathroom key, and somebody's here to see you, that when I would answer the phone, they would just like immediately apologize. It was really crazy. Like at night, we'd get calls all the time too, as the security would call. The alarm has gone off, and Jack would have to get dressed and would have to drive down and have to reset the alarm. And one time it was a real deal. It actually was, you know, somebody had broken in. So we had driven down, and by the time we got there, we were so relieved to see the cruiser there. We pull in, and our relief turns to alarm as the officer with a gun drawn comes and approaches us like we're Bonnie and Clyde. That'll wake you up in a hurry, you know. Then there was one time, we got a call at like 4 a.m. It was like a new guy that had worked there, and he was calling up, wanting to be bailed out of jail. He said, he said that he needed $400 and he needed a ride, and that he was being held on a warrant for outstanding parking tickets. I just hand the phone over to my husband and I say, is this in your job description? It was crazy. There were all sorts of colorful characters that worked at the store. I think everybody, how many people here have probably worked at the store at one time or another? I know I did. I figured if you can't beat them, join them. And it was like a way that I could finally get to see my husband on Sundays for a change. It was crazy. We had so many stories that started with, you can't make this stuff up, about some crazy thing that had happened at the store that day. One of my favorite characters, we would joke that it was a place for saints and sinners. And one of my favorite characters worked at the store forever. And he took court under a sign that said, 10 words or less. He had the greatest eye roll that said more words than anything could ever say. And when somebody would come to the register for the umpteenth time asking where the Roxbury Gap Road was, he would just roll his eyes and dryly say, I'm not from the area. He was a dear guy. You could go to any of the other registers, though, and you might find people there sharing their dental work that they recently got, or a scar they had from some operation, or TMI about a relationship they had that had soured. And this was coming from both sides of the counters. It was like the customers and the staff, they shared things. It was genuine, and it was true. It was really kind of unique, not something you find in every business. But that's why I felt like home. It was like real people were there, you know? It really was great. These were the people that you know, they trusted each other. It was really genuine and really real. You know, sometimes, like all people that spend a lot of time under the same roof, there'd be dust-ups and fights, and that would go with outbursts and icy silences. But mostly it wasn't like that. It was really, really good. These were the folks that would mind your dog, and the people that would help you celebrate your kids' accomplishments. These were the folks that you shared laughter and tears with, sometimes hospital visits, and sometimes last goodbyes. In 2020, the pandemic came, and the store changed hands. And that heartbeat, you know, kind of heart of the community vibe died. I miss it. And when I drive by now, the store, it's kind of like visiting a house that I used to live in, and where I grew up. Only it's no longer there, no longer mine. I guess family is where you find it, whether you're looking for it or not. Someday we'll write the book, because really, we have stories to tell. 40 years, a treasure trove of stories, of people that we got to know and love. And really, we'll make sure that we change the names to protect the innocent and the guilty. Because you know, you can't make this stuff up. Stay tuned.
All right. Waitsfield resident Siobhan Travers is next, telling a story entitled Finding My Purpose in Iowa's Heartland. When asked the question, who was your favorite relative as a child, Siobhan said it was my Aunt Bertha. She taught me how to cook and sew. She had built a cabin in the woods, and she had a great laugh. Put your hands together for Siobhan.
Take that bicycle trip to Iowa, my mother said. It'll do you good and you'll find your purpose. I was 37, a newly single mother with 2 teenage boys living in northern New York and completely lost. On a regular basis, I'd call my mom, wake her up in the middle of the night, and cry. My then husband had served me with divorce papers a few months earlier, and I'd lost my self-confidence, and I had no idea how I was going to cope in life without him. But Mom, I said, it's too late to sign up for RAGBRAI. You had to pre-register. Oh, Siobhan, she said, when have rules ever stopped you from doing anything? Just go. Somehow I believed, and as my mother had promised, that if I got myself to Iowa, that my new purpose would become clear. So I asked my 14-year-old son and my 13-year-old son if they'd like to come to Iowa too. My 14-year-old, Corey, sheepishly agreed as long as I'd find him a bicycle. Well, that did it. I found him a bicycle. I bought 2 tickets to Sioux City Airport. We packed all of our belongings in panniers and we were off. Shipped the bikes there, went to the bike store when we got there in Sioux City, put our panniers on the back of the bicycle. We were set to go, rode about 500 feet and realized, wait a minute, we never practiced with any weight on the back of these bicycles. We couldn't do it, and we were wobbling all over the road. Okay, I had to think really fast because otherwise this whole thing was going up in flames. Now, RAGBRAI was then in its 21st year, and by then it had a cult following of over 20,000 riders and their support crew. When we eventually wobbled into the campground, I looked around, and there were thousands of bicycles, thousands of people, and thousands of tents. My eyes focused on this one guy. He had white hair. He was having a good time, really jovial, talking to people, and drinking something out of a red Solo cup. Yep, that was my target. So I sauntered up to him sweetly and explained our problem. Could he come up with an idea on how we could get our gear across Iowa? Oh, no worries, he said. I'm riding with the Rainbow Riders of Cedar Falls, Iowa. Just come to our U-Haul tomorrow morning and chuck your stuff in the back of our truck. Problem solved. Corey and I pitched our tent, settled in for the night. Next morning, we woke up, we're all excited. We packed all our gear up, went looking for the Rainbow Riders U-Haul. Couldn't find it. I was impatient. There were hundreds of U-Hauls around. I said to Corey, they're all going the same place. We can just throw our gear on any truck. Okay, Mom, that's what we did. So we threw it on any truck. Luckily, I wrote the license plate number and pen on my hand before we left. So there we were, cycling with all the thousands of other people. A few hours later, Mr. Red Solo Cup found Corey in that sea of cyclists. He said, I didn't see you this morning. Where did you and your mom stash all your gear? Corey said, oh, Mom told me to just throw it in the back of any U-Haul. They're all going to the same place. And he said, oh, that wasn't a good idea. Lots of those trucks parked 20 miles away from where the campsite is. Well, Corey cycled up to me and told me the story. That put me in a tizzy. All I could think was, how are we going to do the entire week? No tent, no sleeping bags, and no change of clothes. I had no idea what we were going to do. What a ridiculous decision I'd made. Anyway, 60 miles later, we got to the campground, and lo and behold, I found that U-Haul, and our gear was right on the side of the curb. Whew, tremendously relieved. I promised Corey we'd go find those Rainbow Riders and camp with them for the rest of the week. Now, Iowa. Trip across Iowa should be a family-friendly event, right? That's what I thought. No, not at all. At 8 a.m. every morning, adults started mixing and drinking Bloody Marys. There were naked beer slides on everyday occurrence, and lecherous males, including Mr. Red Solo Cup, were pursuing me left and right. It was tough every day. The days were hot, they were humid, we had no shade, and by the time we'd get in at night, there was barely a patch of ground where we could put that tent. On our second day, this group, now people that were in teams too, so this group who dressed as killer bees, they dressed like honeybees or something, they surrounded me, and then they stung me with this sticker on my arm that said I'd been stung by the killer bees. That was pretty bizarre. That was day 2. On our third day on the trip, I think I hadn't had enough water or Gatorade, and I almost succumbed to heat exhaustion. We found an air-conditioned convenience store. I went inside, lay on the ground of the store. Corey sat outside, and later when I was feeling better, he said, Mom, I spent a lot of time trying to think about how I was going to get you home in a box. On day 4, I decided, hey, it's time to have a Budweiser, because it was a tradition at RAGBRAI. You always were supposed to have some kind of drink before the last stop for the night. I'd not done that before, but I did it that day. Had my Budweiser, got back on my bike. A few miles later, fell off my bicycle. Thump, 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 went my helmet on the ground. Corey looked at me in horror. I picked myself up. I was fine, and he just shook his head. And on our very last morning of the last day of the trip, I said to Corey, you see that church across the street? Can you go sit on those church steps under that roof? It was raining a bit. I'm going to go in this bar, and I'm going to hang out with people that are riding. So that's what Corey did, because what else could he do? Now, obviously, this trip was not one of my finest moments as a parent, but we made it home successfully. And then I got back home. That same question kept coming up. What was my purpose? My mother had told me I'd find a purpose. Did I really find any purpose out there in Iowa? I thought not, but then I reflected about the trip. And I found that once again, I had self-confidence, and I'd learned how to make decisions on the fly without any other partner. That was my beginning of my way forward, and also a way to say goodbye to my past. A year later, I took both my sons on a 400-mile bicycle trip around Prince Edward Island. No U-Hauls and no naked beer slides. And Corey, who's now 43, when he was 30, he called me up and he said, Mom, I'm moving to Iowa. And guess where he lives? Right in that very town where he sat on the steps for 2 hours in the pouring rain waiting for his mother to come out of the bar. Thank you.
Susan Lloyd is next. She lives in Fayston. She's telling a story entitled The Calendar. When asked the question, who was your favorite relative as a child, she claimed it was her Aunt Gail. She was a lefty like me and an artist who made me feel special with her personalized artwork. Her favorite was a ceramic lamp that she made of her in her softball uniform. Put your hands together for Susan.
Who is that guy? He looks really familiar. A friend of mine quizzically asked his wife as she had just unwrapped a calendar from a Yankee swap, and they tried to figure out who these random strangers were on the cover of each month, on the top of the month. And it reminded me of, you know when you go to the store and you buy a frame for a photograph, and it has those fake people in it? And they're always really attractive, and they're yachting, or they're a perfectly functional looking family wearing matching sweaters like hooked over their shoulders. That's kind of what this calendar looked like. So my brother decided to go on a vacation, and he invited his wife, his son, his stepkids, their significant others, and my mom. And my nephew then invited my daughter. And it's not that our family is overly close or that we do things together, so while it was a bit of a surprise that he wanted to go on a family vacation, it wasn't a surprise that he didn't invite me. But still, I was kind of annoyed. I felt snubbed because many of the people he did invite were not exactly the best part of our family tree. They were some of the most challenging members of our family tree. So, you know, it was kind of one of those things that you wanted to be invited to just so you could say no. You know, so you could say, oh, no, and then feel smug and better about yourself, right? So that was kind of how it was. So this was all fine, but fast forward to my mom wasn't able to go, so because her partner and my sister were having health issues. Fast forward to Thanksgiving, my sister-in-law decided to regale us with pictures of this fabulous trip that none of us went on. And she was holding court in the kitchen and had 8,000 pictures of trees and the ocean and, you know, things that we didn't get to experience, not that we were bitter. And I got up quietly to leave the room, and my mom called out to me. You know how people give you that look like, save me? Oh, Susan, why don't you show us some pictures? So I had been on this fabulous vacation to the UK and England and Ireland over the summer, and my mom was trying to throw me this lifeline, like, why not show us some pictures, Susan? But before I could even respond, my sister-in-law practically hip-checked me out of the way to show one more picture of a tree. Now, my brother and I had always shared a certain absurd sense of humor, and we both were somewhat aloof from our family, so we're not really the closest members, but he and I kind of had that in common, so we bonded. But my sister-in-law, super competitive, politically correct, and has to have nice things and feel better and superior to the rest of the family, so she insisted on continuing with the photo shoot. So I got up and kind of sulked out of the room. Meanwhile, in another part of the house, my sister had just discovered that my brother had a racist dog. She was watching the football game, and any time a person of color came on the screen, the dog started barking her head off. Well, this was even more obnoxious than the photo, you know, having to watch look at all these pictures. So my sister-in-law, the plus side was she had to stop showing the pictures, get up, come out of the kitchen, come into the family room, scoop up the dog, cover the dog's eyes so the dog couldn't see the TV screen. My sister and I thought this was hilarious. It couldn't happen to a nicer person. And my sister-in-law was so distraught that she had a racist dog. Well, this really just spurred us on, of course, because we knew that she and my brother had driven all the way to Pennsylvania and spent thousands of dollars to buy a purebred Shih Tzu or something in Amish country. So I said to my sister, how long has your dog been a racist? And how do you think it became a racist? Didn't you buy this dog in Amish country? Does that mean the Amish are racist? Is that what's happening? She glared at me, as you might imagine. I was cutting into her airtime, with my own family, so she wasn't really that happy with me. But how could she one-up the family with her fabulous descriptions of this vacation when she had a racist dog to deal with? So I got a point for that. A couple weeks later, in the mail, I get a small cardboard package, and it's a calendar of all of the people that went on this trip without me. Frolicking in Hawaii, matching outfits. I was not happy. I didn't take it well. It was bad enough to not be invited to something I didn't want to go to. But to see other people having fun without me was just too much. So a friend of mine suggested that I reclaim the incident and bring this calendar to the upcoming Yankee swap party. Brilliant. So go to the party, and the person is unwrapping the gift, and my friend starts laughing, as you would. And that was perfect because everyone thought she was the jerk with the gift and I got to sit on the couch. And they start unwrapping it and we're laughing. She's laughing. I'm doing the poker face, look away kind of thing. And at first they were just puzzled, They're flipping through. It was the funniest thing to watch people try to make a connection that simply didn't exist. You know what I'm saying? Like they're looking, is this your cousin? Do you know this person? Is this Ryan Reynolds? Do we know nothing. You don't know these people. And then they dug in, They really were like, we're gonna solve this mystery, And they really want to know who these people are. And then they start reading the captions and the calendar. Uncle Jimmy's birthday. Who is Uncle Jimmy? And why do we care when it's his birthday? And at that point, I really started to lose it because I knew it was just a matter of time. When they flipped down to April, they would see my name, and I would be caught. And then everyone would know that these nut jobs were all related to me. So, because if you're paying attention, I made the cut for the captions on the calendar, but not the actual calendar or the vacation that preceded the photos to take the calendar. I see how it is. These folks were not nearly as amused by any of this as I was. In fact, they didn't even take the gift home with them. And that made it even funnier because I then slipped the calendar into another unsuspecting friend's bag here in the valley. So if by chance you see a calendar around town with a series of attractive random strangers wearing matching clothing accompanied by a racist dog, that's my dysfunctional family. Say hello, aloha.
All right, we're going to take a little break, but before we do, I have a few quick announcements. One, there was, I promise you, an envelope in your program. Oh, look at that, lights. There's an envelope in your program. Feel free to stuff something in that envelope and leave it in the ticket booth. Second, I believe we have some refreshments out in the lobby Yes, we do, says Ruth Ann. So help yourself, and there's a little donation box if you feel so inclined. And lastly, next Friday at the Jocelyn Memorial Library is a poetry slam. Hosted by renowned poet Jeff Hewitt, and registration is happening right now and is highly encouraged to do so beforehand for both readers and audience members. So it's going to be much like tonight, but around poetry. And you can go to the JocelynMemorialLibrary.com website and register there. Okay, so stretch for 10, and then we'll start our second half.
Woohoo! Welcome to Act 2. How's it going? Having fun? Yeah? All right. Okay, next up we have Erica Nichols-Fraser of Waitsfield. She's going to be telling us a story, Old Dogs, Children, and Watermelon Wine. When asked the question, who was your favorite relative as a child, Erica exclaimed, my Aunt Lo, because she played a game with me that called the Green-Eyed Blah. Oh, monster, I missed that. The Green-Eyed Blah monster. She's still one of my favorites. Please welcome Erica.
My grandfather loved to sail, but he wasn't always the easiest person to sail with. Family lore has it that when my mother was 13 and crewing for him in a race, she got so fed up with him barking orders at her that she actually dived off the boat and swam to shore. I don't blame her. While he was a kind and generous person on land, sort of a different person on the boat, there was a lot of yelling, a lot of miscommunication, and at least once he kicked a child's hand to get him to do what he wanted him to do. He was 6'5" and a large guy, so we called him Big Daddy. And when I was young, my grandmother declared that she was never stepping foot on a boat with him again. And though they remained married for several more decades, I'm pretty sure she didn't. So they bought a boat, a 34-foot tartan, when they moved up to Vermont and kept it on Lake Champlain. In the summer I was 12, he drove me every day to the Lake Champlain Yacht Club, where he'd sign me up for sailing lessons, and he would go out on his boat by himself. But eventually he decided that he missed the Connecticut shore that he grew up on. So he sold that boat, bought a different tartan, and named it Old Dogs, and brought it down to Noank Village Boatyard in Noank, Connecticut. No one was really crazy about the name Old Dogs, but it came from a song by Tom T. Hall called Old Dogs and Children and Watermelon Wine, which goes, ain't but three things in this world that's worth a solitary dime, but old dogs and children and watermelon wine. Now, I don't know about watermelon wine because Big Daddy quit drinking when I was very young, but he sure did love old dogs and children almost as much as he loved sailboats. And when my best friend Kelsey and I were teenagers through our 20s, we would drive down every summer to Noank and go sailing with him and my aunts Lo and Di. One such trip, Big Daddy and Lo were at each other's throats like they usually were on the boat. And Kels got wind of this and, as a distracting tactic, decided to ask him, hey, Big Daddy, I saw a documentary on the America's Cup the other day. What do you know about it? Now, the thing about Big Daddy is that when he was interested in something, he'd become obsessed with it. And he was a really smart guy, so he had an encyclopedic knowledge of things such as the America's Cup, and she knew it. So he proceeded for the next 4 hours, while the rest of us sailed, to tell her everything he knew about the America's Cup. And at the end of the sail, Lo turned to her and said, God bless you. On one of those trips with the 5 of us, those of us who did drink had had a late night, and around the crack of dawn, he decided to get up and make some coffee. Being a large guy on a small boat, he wasn't quiet, and he pulled out a drawer right next to my head where I was sleeping in the galley with a Ziploc bag full of silverware, proceeded to shake it like a maraca in my face for what must have been at least a minute, and soon everyone was up. But being stubborn, I turned over and kept pretending to sleep. Di soon realized that she couldn't find her phone anywhere, and that it must have been left at the restaurant we were at the night before. So she, Kels, and Lowe piled into the dinghy and decided to go to shore and see if they could track it down, while I was left with Big Daddy. I continued to try to pretend to sleep while he clomped around, and there was this buzzing, this incessant buzzing that felt like it was in my head. And while granted I was a little hungover, he seemed to hear it too. And my head was leaning up against the fridge. And while he is throwing open every drawer and slamming cabinets and cursing and trying to find this damn thing, where it's coming from, finally he opens up the fridge, reaches into a case of beer, and pulls out the cell phone, which is still ringing because, as I was told later, Di's leaving messages to the phone saying, "Don't worry, I'm coming for you." He answers the phone and says, "Get back here, you idiots, I have your damn phone." He sailed right up until the end. When he fell on his boat, collapsed on his boat, and was diagnosed with Alzheimer's. 7 months later, I held his hand and sang to him as he left this world. Now, in the meantime, Kelsey had moved to the Caribbean and become a captain on a catamaran that chartered in St. John. And she was interviewed for Caribbean Magazine in a feature series called Women at the Helm. And after my grandfather, Big Daddy, had passed, she brought the magazine to my grandmother and pointed out where she was asked, "How did you learn to sail?" And she said, my best friend's grandfather taught me everything." Though he passed away in January 2018, we waited until the summer to spread his ashes off Old Dogs into the Long Island Sound, with my brother on the dock playing guitar and singing, "Ain't but 3 things in this world that's worth a solitary dime, but old dogs and children and watermelon wine." Thank you.
Our next storyteller has hoofed it all the way down from Burlington, Dennis McSorley, L-E-Y. Just want to make sure everyone understands that. The story is called That Thursday in November. When asked the question, who was your favorite relative as a child, Dennis offered up my Uncle Pete, Dad's brother, because he was funny, played the harmonica, and his real name was actually Eugene. When I asked my father why he was called Pete, not Gene, he said, somebody called him that, and it stuck. Okay. Please welcome Dennis.
So my family is like any other family, except it's not quite like yours, maybe. But I just remember I have so many memories, and I picked a holiday type story because it kind of encompasses the whole crew. There are 6 of us, 4 kids. My brother was born on my 16th birthday, and I'm the oldest, and there's 2 sisters and my mother and father. My dad was a New York City cop, and he usually said yes, no, or ask your mother. So this is really about my mother. My mother was just the embodiment of like a stage mother. She was over the top. It was big. So any type of holiday, St. Patrick's Day, Valentine's Day, the house would just look like the inside of a department store. So she just loved all of this stuff. So Thanksgiving became the lowest expectation day. And I remember as a kid, as a little kid, when I was about 9, we didn't even have a dining room, so we had a folding table that you couldn't put your elbows on because you would collapse the table. And my grandmother and grandfather would come down from upstairs. They were the Germans who we lived with, and we'd sit around this thing. My father was sometimes working as a cop. He didn't get the day off. And my mother would often put the turkey in the oven, dress us in our so-called Sunday clothes, and we would take the subway over to Manhattan. We'd watch the Macy's Thanksgiving Day Parade, come home and eat. Of course it went on and on and on. I got married and then had to go to other Thanksgivings, but eventually we're going to go to where my father retired, and my mother and father moved to the Poconos in Pennsylvania. And there my mother had a spectacular table, so now she could have us all there. And we were all expected to be there. There were really no excuses. And Eileen married a cop against my mother's best wishes, so she would always, I'd ask my mother, is Eileen coming? And she'd say, I don't know, I haven't heard from her yet. I said, well, it's no surprise. Thanksgiving is that Thursday in November. It hasn't changed. Is she going to come or not? Kathleen would always be there. She was single, so she wasn't expected to ever have to host or cook. Eileen never invited anybody because we always had to be at my parents'. I'd show up, bring my then wife, my son along. We had a little boy, and we'd all sit around. Now, I don't know about your house, but we could have a script. Like it would be, you could almost like, this is the way it was going to go every single time. You had the same seats. You knew what you were going to say. You knew what was going to happen. My mother wouldn't let you in the kitchen. She'd just yell at my father, tell him to cut the bird. She didn't like how he did it. She had every vegetable made in North America on the table. Brussels sprouts, spring beans, trousers, and she'd be in a sweat, and she'd sit down, and she'd say, oh, I forgot the biscuits, and she'd go get those, and now, so we're sitting there kind of laughing it up, and we didn't talk about how we felt. We talked about other things like the world, and we get in tremendous arguments. But before that, she'd say, all right, Edward, that's my father. Edward, say a nice prayer. Every year, he would simply say, bless us, O Lord, for these thy gifts which we are about to, which is a Catholic prayer you say after a meal. And she would always go, is that the best you can do? And this was every single year for 15 years. Is that the best you could do? I don't know what she expected. She expected something better. And, my father just was a defiant kind. He was never going to do anything different than that. So my brother, who was gay, and we never mentioned that, he'd be there, and his partner was in a hotel someplace in town. He wasn't allowed to come. My sister hated the entire family, and my older sister and I, we kind of got along, but we would argue about, the Pope or something like that. It was never a nice day. The football game would help. So about 20 years later, 20 years ago, the phone rings. And it's my sister crying hysterically, Kathleen, the oldest. And she said, Mom died. And I go, what? And she goes, yeah, Dad found her in bed. She had a massive heart attack, so she's dead. So this was in September. So now, all of a sudden, we're like, uh-oh. Thanksgiving just went down with my mother. We have no Thanksgiving. We're all fish out of water on the dock. We're like, time is going by. So Kathleen says, I'll take care of it. Now, I knew she had a two-room apartment. She wasn't going to cook. And she said, I'll take care of it. So she lives in Howard Beach, Queens. I'm now up here in Vermont. My father's in the Poconos. My brother's in Colorado. And my sister Eileen lives in Long Island. She says, all right, I took care of it. Friday, Carlucci's in Howard Beach, which is like a low-level mafia restaurant. So I'm serious. Gotti lived in the neighborhood, those guys. So we all show up. My brother-in-law, Bruce, my sister Eileen shows up. Kathleen is there. My brother is there. Not his partner. He's still not allowed to bring his gay partner to this thing, my father. And we got manicotti and garlic sticks and sausage and meatballs and a lot of bread. And Italian waiters who were 100 years old. And my father says to me, he didn't talk a lot, but he said, Dennis, something's not right. And I said, I know what it is. He goes, you do? Fill me in. I said, well, it's Friday. It's not Thanksgiving. Thanksgiving was yesterday. We're not eating any turkey, if you noticed. And Mom's dead. He goes, yeah, that's it. He goes, thank you. He didn't say thank you, but he kind of went, yeah, okay, thank you for filling that in. So now we had to figure out what are we going to do for the rest of these Thanksgivings. We had to have a new tradition, which you may have done in your family too as time goes on. So my brother, and my sister Kathleen still didn't. I got married again. I got divorced and married again, and we invited everybody to our place here in South Burlington. Well, my sister Kathleen showed up. My son showed up, and my brother showed up with his partner, so he could be out of the closet with us, and he was there, and they made a move. So it would go on like that. So we were keeping this thing going, and a couple of times I, of course, would go to see my new in-laws and go to their sisters in Maryland. So we were doing Thanksgiving continuously. So not to have it die off, we didn't want that to happen. So in the last number of years, both of my sisters have passed away. Both had cancer, and it was crazy. They were young, 60s. And it was just my brother and I, the two bookends. My parents had died, so we're orphans. And he's moved to Calgary, but first he was still in Denver. So I said to him, look, you've always came here. I'll start coming out to Denver, and I'll do Thanksgiving with you. And his in-laws, you want to call them, or his partner, they're all Mexicans. So they're doing all kinds of crazy burritos and anything but and a turkey on top of everything else like that. So we're eating all kinds of food, and we're watching football, and it's like just another group getting together, and I'm a member of this extended family. So that's kind of like, I mean, you know, it's not a tradition anymore, but it is in the sense that it's important, I think, that there was a consistency to it. No matter what the jokes were, no matter what the arguments might have been, we made a pact as a family to stay together and do it. There were tons of memories created out of all of these experiences, as you all have too, which are really important. And no matter what your family's like, or however, who's getting along with who, there is something about seeing that it's more important to just be together and try your best, even if it's just for that one particular day. Thank you.
Okay, next up we have Bill Nowlin of Moortown with a story called Grounded. When asked the question, who was your favorite relative as a child, Bill said, my Uncle Frank on my father's side. He was the sole resident FBI agent in Vermont in the 1950s. He was a kind soul who dreaded the Vermont assignment because he spent much of his time tracking down Army deserters, oh no, who were often just homesick farm boys. Please welcome Bill.
My mother was an orphan, born in 1921 in Milton, Massachusetts. The town was a wealthy suburb of Boston where my grandmother was employed as a domestic servant. Her sister died when she was 7. Within 18 months, both her mother and father were also dead. She was alone at the age of 9. My mother very rarely spoke of her childhood, but she did say that her sister died of strep throat, her mother had cancer, and her father died of something called Berger's disease. Look it up if you have to. I'm a doctor and I had to. Anyway, somebody decided that young Claire should go live with her father's unmarried sister. Auntie was an elementary school principal who had the means to provide my mother with a comfortable, albeit rather joyless, second decade. She graduated from college in 1943 and became a stewardess for Northeast Airlines. And at that time, you had to be single to be a stewardess. So she was forced into retirement when she married my father in 1947. She actually had a miscarriage, but then my older brother was born in 1949. Later that year, she was pregnant with twins. When the twins were born, she developed severe depression and required hospitalization. Despite her very traumatic childhood, she really had no history of any overt mental illness before that time. She weathered my birth okay in 1952, but after my younger sister was born in 1956, she again developed a very severe depression which required prolonged hospitalization. My older siblings and I actually went to an orphanage for 3 or 4 months. She struggled with depression for the rest of her life. In the interest of brevity, I will spare you all the gory details, but there was shock treatments and experimental surgery. It was pretty rough. In 1988, at the age of 67, she mercifully died of a sudden cardiac arrest. I'd always been skeptical about her improbable family history, and after a year or so, I decided it was okay to finally do some snooping. She had a one surviving cousin who we rarely saw, and she was not much help. I decided to start my investigation by going to the Milton Town Hall, and get her birth certificate. When I walked in the building, I could immediately see rows of birth, marriage, and death records on a shelf behind the counter in the town clerk's office. There was a pleasant young woman who gave me a form to fill out and took my check for $25. But she disappeared and was replaced by an older woman who, rather dour older woman, who told me that she was going to need some identification. I was kind of puzzled because I hadn't brought any documentation that had my mother's maiden name on it. But she took my driver's license and made a photocopy. She also told me in a very annoyed voice that the records she would need are in a safe, and they can only be opened by the town manager. The town manager was in a meeting, and I would have to wait at least half an hour. At that point, a police cruiser pulled up to the building, and an officer got out and took position next to the door, fully armed, this guy. So I'm sitting there waiting. The cop and the woman are sort of keeping an eye on me, and I say, finally, could somebody please tell me what is going on? But the woman told me to just be patient and that she couldn't say anything. At that point, my mind was just running, my imagination was running wild. You know, I had thoughts of Lizzie Borden, Charles Manson. Maybe my mother had somehow survived some horrific, infamous murder-suicide. Anyway, as I stood there, I could see for the first time that there was actually a missing volume in the section on birth records. I was now at the counter, and it was not far off. At that point, the town manager showed up and disappeared into the back, and he returned with the missing volume. The clerk began to fill out my birth certificate, a birth certificate, not mine, and I just couldn't resist asking one more time, could you please tell me what is going on? She replied rather curtly, certainly you must know. At that point, I was certain that my life was about to change forever, and probably for the worse. So I just kept pleading ignorance, and finally she just changed her tone completely. She just softened and said, "This volume contains the birth record of the President of the United States." Indeed, George Herbert Walker Bush, AKA George I, was born on June 12th, 1924, in the town of Milton, Massachusetts. Apparently, they are extremely proud of this fact and protective of his legacy, despite the fact that the family upped and moved to Greenwich within a year, never to return. Meanwhile, this previously unpleasant woman becomes very affable, and she points out the entry of of George Bush's birth record on the same page as my mother's, and she very kindly pointed out that the address where my mother was born was known to be used by a local midwife to deliver the babies of servants and indigent women. So I proceeded on to the Boston City Hall, where I effortlessly obtained the birth records of both my grandparents and my aunt. There were no surprises. I was a little disappointed that my little inquest was so unrevealing, but that's probably a good thing. But I still wish I understood better what was going on in my mother's head all those years. She endured great adversity as a young woman, but for a while she was literally flying high until she wasn't, grounded by marriage and motherhood. These days I like to think that my mom had more in common with Amelia Earhart than Lizzie Borden. Thank you.
Funny story. Susan and I, after we did last year's, we realized we forgot, I told this part of the story where we forgot to introduce the theme, and I just realized, I said, Susan, we forgot to introduce ourselves at the beginning of the evening. Well, I'm your host for the evening, Doug Bergstein, and thanks for coming. Anyway, part of my job I see as convincing people to step out of their comfort zone and do something that they haven't done before and get them through the process, encouraging and convince them that they're going to be just fine up here. And with that, I'd like to introduce our last storyteller of the evening. Sue Richardson of Beverly, Mass. is telling a story about morning chaos. When asked the question, who was your favorite character as a child, Sue said, my dad. Not only was he an awesome provider for his 11 children, he was a problem solver, a tinkerer, a teacher, a comedian who had a quick wit and always used hyperboles to make a point. He loved the great outdoors and often brought the whole gang hiking with him. Although he was small in stature, he was a huge part of who I am today. Please welcome Sue.
Stepping out of my comfort zone. I grew up in a 3-bedroom house in Salem, Massachusetts. With 13 people living under the same roof, it was really quite crazy, especially trying to get ready for school in the morning. I had 2 adoring parents, 3 older brothers, and 7 older sisters. It was brutal. Anyway, my brother Don, my oldest brother Don, moved out the month that I was born, and because he had enlisted in the Air Force. My sister Ellen had moved out by the time I had reached kindergarten. Our biggest challenge was getting ready for school in the morning, especially trying to get to the bus on time. But all that changed after this one fateful morning. The sleeping arrangements in my house consisted of my parents, who slept on the first floor, with twin beds. I kind of doubt that they always had twin beds. In fact, I think that was probably their new birth control. Upstairs, we had 2 bedrooms and a small half bath, a really small half bath. On one bedroom, there were my 2 brothers, who were still at home, and my sister Carolyn, who shared a room. In the other room, we had 2 beds, 6 girls, all in 2 beds. So me being the youngest, I was always stuck in the middle. Bad breath and long toenails were enough to drive me absolutely insane. If one sister rolled over, I'd get that dragon breath in my face and just like, ugh. And if I didn't roll over fast enough, they would claw me with their toenails. Just imagine an ice scraper going across a windshield on those cold mornings. That's what it felt like. I think I'm still scarred for life. Anyways, we didn't have any alarm clocks in my house. We didn't need them because my dad would always go to the bottom of the stairs and test the fire alarm in the house. And we're all up scrambling, getting our turn in the bathroom, run downstairs, grab a breakfast, run back upstairs, and get ready for school. It was that fast. The boys always got to use the bathroom first, who knows why, but that's how it went. So all the girls would jump into the one bedroom, the other bedroom, and all get dressed at once. Wait a minute. My budding teenage sister Cynthia would get dressed in the closet. It was probably because that one time when we were all a bunch of us were taking the bath together, and I disgustingly pointed out her furry muff. I'm like, "What's that?" And Mom decided, "Okay, Cynthia, you can take baths by yourself at this point." So after getting dressed, we'd all jump into the bathroom, the 6 of us, all in that little tiny bathroom together. And me being the smallest, scrawny kid, had to jump up on a stool, up on my tippy toes, get my face into the sink to brush my teeth because I didn't want to get any toothpaste all over me. And my sisters Beth and Claire were my bookends, and we're both trying our best to brush our teeth. Above us stood Cynthia, Paul, and Priscilla. They're donning their makeup and brushing their teeth at the same time. And wouldn't you know it, they're dripping toothpaste onto our heads below. I literally felt like I was under a flock of seagulls. Brutal, just brutal. So anyways, I would always be the first one dressed. I'd run downstairs and sit at the kitchen table in my mom's seat, and I'd watch all the birds pecking away, jumping around the yard, eating all the crumbs that she had thrown out. It was a muddy, grassless backyard. Never grew grass with all those kids. I mean, you just can't. While I'm sitting there doing that, my mom is smoking a cigarette and making her lunches for us. And she had this production line that even Ford would be proud of. Peanut butter, peanut butter, peanut butter, peanut butter. Jelly, 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 jelly. Wax paper and a whole bunch of paper bags. I was in awe. Not at the birds that were hopping around, because there were so many of them at this point, and not at her precision at this incredible production line. But it was like, how long could she keep that ash on that cigarette and not drop them on our sandwich? I was like, I couldn't believe it. It was like, what a skill. Beautiful. So finally it was our turn to go down to the bus stop. And, you know, there's, nine of us running down to the bus stop. And we can see all the traffic is stopped. We're like, oh crap, the bus has already gone by. So we know that we have to cross this busy Loring Avenue to get to the other side. The bus goes up, turns around, comes back, and he knows we have to cross, so he puts his flashes on. My sister Cynthia grabs my right hand. I grabbed her right hand. Claire grabbed her left hand. And she steps out past all the stopped cars. While this young driver decides to pass everybody and comes up the middle. Oh, no. Claire and Cynthia saw him, and I didn't, and I hit the side of his car and went flying backwards. Everybody on the bus saw it. All the kids are screaming, "Oh my God, she's dead!" And of course, I'm freaking out. I'm really upset. I'm really worried. The police showed up. There were all kinds of traffic at this point. I think not only were we late, but the whole bus was late at that point. I don't know who made it to school that day. But anyways, I didn't feel comfortable until I saw my parents. They came down the street finally. Mom in a robe, Pall Mall hanging out of her mouth most likely. And she was shaken. She was really upset. But my dad, I didn't feel comfortable until my dad scooped me into his arms, and I was like, oh, I'm here. Thank you, Dad. And I'm pretty sure a bunch of my other siblings probably felt jealous because I had Dad all to myself. I mean, and that's a rare occasion because he worked so hard, worked 2 jobs all his life. Anyways, they go off to school, everything clears off. I go to the emergency room with my dad. Lucky for me, it was just bumps and bruises. Lucky for all of us, Dad made changes to the house. So he put another bedroom in the basement so the boys can sleep downstairs, and we had more room upstairs to get ready for school. And we weren't late anymore. I do miss the closest of my siblings, all clamoring in that bathroom together. But being the youngest, with all the dysfunction in the family, the crowded beds, no privacy, toothpaste in the head, I wouldn't change anything in the world except maybe some clipped toenails and sleeping arrangements. In fact, bunk beds would have been wicked cool. Thank you.
Well, could we get the storytellers up to the stage, those from the audience, for one final recognition? And remember the Poetry Slam next Friday. And, you know, without all of you in the audience, the storytellers would have no one to tell their stories to. So how about a round of applause?
Thank you.